Sounds good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Liberty and Consciousness. We have a very special episode having an honest conversation on government debt. We have two special guests from the amazing podcast, Words and Numbers, James and Anthony. How are you guys doing today?
Very well, thank you.
And I have my co-host from Texas, Jacob. So my goal here is to really get a good perspective on government debt because me and Jake have discussed it. We're both not economists. I just started the podcast myself, so I'm new learning into this. I have some idea because I've read Rothbard and I've read a little bit of Milton Friedman, looking at some of David Friedman now. But a lot of people are arguing on the internet, you might have seen, well, the problem is the amount. It's the capacity. Well, we just need a bigger check, not 500, 2,000, 6 grand. And the only problem is Mitch McConnell blocking it, which I'd say I disagree. But they don't want to listen to that. They just want to argue that. So if we can get two objectives, really get a solid understanding on the problem of government debt, can it be fixed? How would it be fixed based on Anthony's amazing video? And what can people learn from this so they can stop making bad economic assumptions? Jake had some really interesting insights I want to talk. So I'll actually let Jake lead into some of his ideas about that.
From what I understand about our MMT or our monetary theory we use in the United States, we don't have an asset-based currency backing us. We have a fractional reserve currency. So basically, we can just print away, and really, what gives our dollar value is confidence in confidence in the dollar. I get this from James Rickards. I think that's who I got the idea from originally. In one of his books, I think it was Currency Wars is where I got that idea. Anywho, what actually protects our dollar from anybody calling in our debt is our military, because we could just open up a can of beatdown if we had to. If somebody like China or somebody wanted to intervene and say, hey, we're going to call in our trillions of dollars worth of debt. Also, I guess our petrodollar is what makes it worthwhile as well. So I love that video you sent me, Kareem. It was outstanding. I feel very privileged to talk to the video presenter here, Anthony, and then also hearing James' perspective on this. But my concerns around our modern monetary theory in the United States, and I'm not an expert on this, is when does the dollar defy gravity? I don't understand when this is going to stop. I mean, we just took on $3 trillion worth of debt with this stimulus in 1 year. Furthermore, we've been taking on $1 trillion deficit for over a decade now. So does the dollar, I'll just kick it to one of you guys. Does the dollar defy gravity, or what gives our dollar actual value? Because I agree with James Rickards' idea that it's really confidence and belief, and also our military protecting, somebody going to call in our debt, say China or Germany or Japan or somebody. But I mean, how do we, I guess the right question to ask here is, how do we rein in this wild spending and printing we have?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The Federal Reserve, as you know, can print as much money as it wants. And I want to stop here for a minute because economists use the phrase print money. It doesn't necessarily mean the Federal Reserve is actually physically printing dollars. It can expand the money supply through other means, altering reserve requirement ratios, increasing bank deposits, has a variety of tools. But when we say printing money, what we mean is the Federal Reserve, by whatever tool it chooses, is increasing the money supply. Now, what makes that possible is, interestingly, not the fractional reserve business. Fractional reserve business says that the banks can maintain a certain amount of debt that's some multiple of the amount of dollar bills that they have on hand. And people will point to that and say, well, banks can then just create as much wealth, as much loans as they want. That's not correct. They can create loans up to what they're allowed to create under law, given the number of dollar bills the Federal Reserve has printed. So as long as that number of dollar bills remains constant, then so too will the amount of loans, so too will the money supply. So that's not where your problem lies. Your problem lies with the first thing you mentioned, which is that it's not an asset-based currency. Now there's a pro and a con to this. When we were on a gold standard, by law, the Federal Reserve could only print so many dollar bills that matched how much gold we had. And because the amount of gold was limited, so too were the number of dollars limited. And that's what made the gold standard meaningful and useful. It had nothing to do with the fact that it was gold. It had to do with the fact that this thing, whatever we're talking about, was limited in quantity, that in turn forced the Federal Reserve to limit the number of dollar bills it could print. That's the benefit there. As far as it being gold, it doesn't matter. It could be anything. It could be fresh water. It could be land. In fact, it doesn't even need to be that. You can follow something like Bitcoin. It could be number of prime numbers between one and something, right? Just some fixed something. And it raises the question then that you led to, which is, what is it that makes a dollar valuable? What makes a dollar valuable is the fact that I could walk into a bar and put it down and the guy will give me a beer. That's what makes it valuable. The fact that people will give me goods and services in exchange for that dollar. And so when you start to realize that dollars gain their value because of goods and services, you then start to understand if all we do is print more dollars, we haven't made anybody better off because we have the same number of goods and services that we had to begin with.
This is all straight out of John Locke in the 17th century. Locke said in the second treatise that money is money because we all agree it's money. And when you abuse what it is that we call money, sooner or later, people start to withdraw their consent. And it's not money anymore. And this is what's happened in Venezuela. It happened in Iraq, right? It happens all over the place. World War II, it was Italy and Japan and Germany, on and on and on. So this is what we're up against, right? You can only mess with a currency so much before regular people come to the point where they don't agree that it's money anymore. And they shift what they're going to use as money to something else, some other asset. And, Ant mentions Bitcoin, and that's going to be the obvious competition, right? And how much is Bitcoin worth? Well, I don't know. How much is a dollar worth? And we can quantify that a couple of ways, but these things are very fluid, and they hover around, and you can kind of tell when people lose interest in one thing and gain interest in another. Why is it that the British pound sterling no longer is the world's reserve currency, right? Because people thought after a while that this isn't as good as it could be. And underneath it all, what you have is that any monetary system that's not based on a solid asset, and probably even those that are, is ultimately based on opinion. And that's the same thing that functional politics is based on as well, right? Do the people more or less agree that what they're getting is reasonable enough? And it's not social contract theory where everybody walks in and signs their name. It's more like, okay, are people going with the flow? Are they rebelling in any meaningful way? Right? These are the sorts of softer questions that you end up asking. But I think that's where we are with the currency. And I suspect that the American currency, because of the monumental debt, 28 some trillion dollars now, we got a problem in the making. And there's no way we're going to get out from under this.
Well, let me ask you this. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kareem.
Okay, so to go to Anthony's 10th point, because a lot of people who want to put hope in this generally have been on the Keynesian side. But point 10, if we could hemorrhage or stop the bleeding, which is, I believe, a metaphor for if we could stop the excessive spending and then get the economy to at least make the minimum payments, then we could solve the problem. That gave me a little bit of hope to do that. Is that still possible with everything they're trying to spend on? Like, can lizards walk on treadmills? I'm not trying to even make jokes. Can these toilets do this? Can we send money to Pakistan? As gender studies was a new one on me. So I'm like, part of me wants to say, hey, it's gone. Get Bitcoin, get gold, get tangible assets. And part of me also wants to say, hey, well, there's point 10. If we got the right Congress and the right person in office in 2024, long shot, but maybe if there's some party realignment, Jake, that could work, like you were saying. If we got the right people in Congress, could we hemorrhage the bleeding, like you're saying, and maybe start making the minimum payments and get the economy to work well, so we don't have to worry about whatever it is, 200, 300 trillion now.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the answer to your question is yes, that's possible. And I'll tell you what the recipe is. The recipe is that we cut federal spending right now, 10 to 15%. Well, it was 10% prior to COVID, is probably now 15%. Cut the federal government 15%, hold it at that level for 6 years. At the end of the 6th year, you can then grow federal spending, provided you don't grow it faster than the economy grows. With that recipe alone at the end of 6 years eliminates deficits. So you have no more deficits. And then what happens is the economy will grow to the point that we can manage our $28 trillion debt. And that will take probably the better part of a century. Now, all of that is possible mathematically. It's probably completely impossible politically. And the reason I say this is because, take an example. When Barack Obama was in his 2nd year of his presidency, we talked about cuts to community block grants. It was $300 million. And we debated this as a country for the better part of 3 weeks. People on one side saying, look, we can't afford $300 million. We've got to cut it. People on the other side saying, this is money that's going to the poorest Americans. We need to cut something else, not this. About 3 weeks we spent discussing this. The federal government spends $300 million about every 45 minutes. We spent 3 weeks discussing a problem that was 45 minutes long. And if we can't handle a $300 million cut, there is no way we're going to come close to handling a 10 to 15% cut.
Right. And I would offer a caution, Kareem, to your formulation of the problem. If you begin by saying something like, we need to elect better people, you've already lost. You will never, ever elect better people. You will elect regular people who all kind of see the world in much the same way. So when James Madison was putting the government together with his buddies there in Philadelphia in 1787, what did he say? He said, well, we have to set this up so ambition counteracts ambition. Why? Because we will not be governed by angels. And I think those are definitely words to live by. I read them for the first time probably 30 years ago. And I don't think I've ever seen a good enough counterexample, even one, to cause me to question it. So as long as regular human beings are taking these jobs, or if they're running for office, you've got to have something other than a reliance on the goodness of the people.
Okay, Jake, did you want to make a point?
Yeah. So I'll just do a little bit of rewind here. So I became interested with this federal deficit spending we were doing when Obama got elected. I became a huge Ron Paul supporter. And in the polls, just against Obama, he was favored. And against the Republicans, obviously he was doing well too. But then once the media got involved and manipulated the masses, and plus they didn't give him the right airtime because he's not for the military industrial complex, and he also doesn't support corporate welfare. I mean, he's like a good traditional libertarian. The problem, and you guys both pointed out very well, is I don't think we can realistically elect someone like that because we have so many people in our country that they're so accustomed to government giving them stuff, and it's very hard to pull that back. And that's why I told Kareem I'm not really a libertarian anymore. I'm more of a socio-political realist because I just have to make do with what I have. I really can't vote in the people I want because I told him that's why I voted Trump. I would have voted JoJo, but I'm like, JoJo can't win. That's why I voted for Trump, just to stop. It had nothing to do with JoJo whatsoever. That's why I look at this as, so anyway, back to the Fed. I think probably how we could, I don't even know how there's a tenable solution here other than mass inflation. Everyone just drops the dollar and then we have domestic production, Adam Smith style, just our own country, the butcher, the baker, the friggin', the shoemaker, whatever. And then we have our domestic production ramp up and start over. But that would cause a cataclysmic failure worldwide. What do you guys think? What if the dollar did fail realistically? Like the IMF just dropped us, China they had their own petrodollar, they had their own production, and Brazil had their own production, the EU dropped us. What do you think would happen in that scenario? Either one, Anthony.
That's not an if question, that's a when question. That is going to happen. So the question becomes, on the individual level, what can you do to get yourself through the difficulties that are coming? Because they're absolutely coming. But stepping back just for a second on the Ron Paul business, don't look for conspiracies. Don't look for a complicit media, right? These are not the places to look for answers to what's happening. The real answer, when you talk about electoral politics, the real problem, to the extent there is a problem, and I think it's pretty clear that there is, it's the primary system. So on the Democratic side, what do you have to do to win the primaries? Well, you have to be pretty far out to the left. On the Republican side, what do you have to do? Well, you have to be pretty far out to the right. But then to win the general election, you've got to be right in the middle. And this is what causes politicians to lie and to flip-flop and all these things. It's actually baked right into the idea of what a primary system will yield. So just understand that walking in, that of course that's what you're going to see, right? And you're going to see Donald Trump, the populist, getting as far to the right as he absolutely could. And then Donald Trump, the centrist, right, in the general election, which, if you paid any attention at all to the year before that, is ridiculous. And yet that's what this is the lie that we have to tell each other as we put these things through. I'm sure Anthony will have more of an exact numeric example for what's going to happen in the not too distant future, but keep these things in mind as you look at the political landscape.
And James is right. It's an if question, not a when question. This is this financial path the federal government has taken us down is irreversible at this point. It possibly could have been reversed a couple of decades ago, but it is certainly not reversible politically, and it's bordering on, I would say it's actually past the point of being reversible mathematically. So what's happening here? I think there's some good news that people have to keep in mind. And that is, what we're talking about here is a problem on paper. What is the US dollar worth? Who holds as reserve currency? This sort of thing. What doesn't change here at all is our productive capacity. We have the same resources we always had. We have the same workforce, the same level of intelligence, the same technology. All of that's there. We have the ability to produce all the same goods and services we did before. What's changing is suddenly people's expectations that I had $100 in the bank and I understand what $100 is worth and how much that would buy. And all of a sudden it doesn't buy that anymore. It buys something less. Or I've entered into a contract with some suppliers and they've agreed to sell me, some product at a certain price. And now all of a sudden, while that price is locked in, it's kind of meaningless because the dollar is now worth something, markedly less. So people's expectations and planning is what gets upended here. Once we get through that, you get back to business as usual. That's not to say that it's painless getting through it, but it is to say that when you come through the other end, the world looks very much like it does now.
Right. So in the examples we gave earlier, the Axis powers coming out of World War II, they don't fit into this model at all. Right. They were utterly destroyed in the war. That's a different animal. But if you think about Iraq, well, that shares in the nature of the Axis powers and in the nature of what Anthony's talking about. But by the time you get to Venezuela, you can see what Anthony is talking about, because they have the same productive capacity, more or less. They just can't produce, and that's gonna last for a while. It's because they nationalized the oil industry, right? As long as you've made that mistake, it's going to be a longer time to be able to come back from it. But their productive capacity is theoretically exactly what it ever was. There's no downside here. And yet you can see that it will be probably 20, 30 years before they're even eating again, let alone back in business.
Wow.
And I don't think the US would face a transition of that length, 20, 30 years.
Maybe, maybe not. But what the US would face would be a breakdown of the national border. Right? We wouldn't come out the other side as the United States of America. We would come out the other side as 8, 10, 12 different sovereign nations.
That's possible. That's entirely possible. I hold out hope that we would come out the other side actually looking like we looked at the founding, which is a limited federal government. And most of the stuff we think of as being within the purview of government is actually handled by the states. And
I suspect with the bloodshed that comes along with things like this, that's going to be a tough nut to crack, right? Whatever we euphemistically refer to as the people, they're going to have a hard time accepting this.
Well, you're seeing the optimist and the pessimist here.
Yeah, that's right. And I am certainly more pessimistic than Ant is, although I agree with him completely on the productive capability still being there, right? It's not as if the country were obliterated the way that happened to the Germans, right? We still have everything we need to have. Politically, we're going to have a lot to sort out.
But this goes back to Kareem's original point or question about how did we get here? And you get here very easily. It's highly predictable when you have a government that is free to take whatever it wants and give to whoever it chooses. Because what happens is if I'm a politician, I'm running for office, and I know it's wrong to take from James and give to Kareem, and I know it not only is it wrong morally, but it's probably bad for the economy. But I have an incentive to do it if Kareem is one of my constituents. And if I don't promise to do it, my competitor will. And Kareem will vote for him. So either way, this is going to be done. We're going to take money from James. We're going to give it to Kareem. The question before me is, do I want to be the guy in office when it happens? And, right. and so what happens is these politicians get elected to do this sort of thing. How does it happen? It happens because we became unglued from our Constitution. The whole point of a Constitution is to draw a line and say the federal government may not do anything outside this box. Once you ignore that box, you open the door to politicians doing exactly what I described.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And yet there is more to this, right? Because now we take a fresh look at deficit spending in a condition defined by fiat currency. Okay, it looks a whole lot different now, doesn't it? Because what we're really spending on is these transfers of wealth from one group to another. And then the politicians realize there's not enough. They can't make everybody happy with the amount of money they've got to work with. So screw it, let's print more. And that's the thought that yields the condition we're in, right? Once they realize that this is a possibility, there's no hope anymore because it will inexorably become exactly what we've got.
And this is why you mentioned, Jacob, modern monetary theory. This is why it's become popular. Modern monetary theory, in my opinion, is a crackpot idea, and it would never have seen the light of day had it not been for the fact that politicians saw it as an opportunity to put academic window dressing on what they wanted to do anyway, which is print money.
That's right. And what am I seeing all of a sudden in the national media? I'm seeing a number of opinion pieces, literally in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, that are talking about a UBI. This has fresh new legs because we can have a UBI. Why? Because we could just print more money. Yep. What could possibly go wrong? Let's just make more. So you're going to have this kind of unfortunate set of circumstances, which every American starts getting a check every month because we've already done that. Right, with the COVID disaster relief, we figured out how to do it. And now we're going to figure out, and mark my words, we will figure out how to give every single American the same amount of money every month with no thought paid whatsoever to the debt or the deficit. And there you go. And that's the last gasp of the American constitutional republic.
Now people will push back on what we both said here and say things like, well, if that's true, you print all this money, you get inflation. Where's the inflation? Yeah, we've been printing tons of money.
We figured that one out, though, not too long ago.
Oh, yeah, because what happens is official inflation numbers include only prices of goods and services. They do not count prices of financial assets. So if the federal Reserve prints a bunch of money and that money comes into the system, but doesn't come into the market for goods and services, but instead goes into financial markets, what will you see? You'll see inflation in financial markets. Now, we use a different word for that. We call it a rising stock market, but that's exactly what it is. The prices of the stocks are rising. And if you look at the numbers, how much money the federal government, the Federal Reserve printed for this whole COVID business, you should expect, something like 10, 15, maybe 20% inflation. No inflation. But if you look at the stock market, it sunk by a huge amount at the opening of the lockdowns, and then almost immediately rose by about that same 15 to 20%.
Right.
Now, and people were saying at the time, how can it be possible that the stock market is doing great and yet the economy is shut down? We've got record unemployment. A third of businesses are going out of business. What's going on? What's going on is it was the inflation. It's in the financial markets.
And if you doubt this, if anybody watching this doubts this, just go pull up a 30-year chart on the Dow or the S&P 500 and take a good long look at it. Track price to earnings ratios over 3 or 4 decades. You'll see it very, very clearly. There's just literally no doubt in my mind that this is what's going on. The doubt in my mind is as to what percentage of what we're seeing is attributable to this and what percentage is attributable to something else. But that this is happening, I have literally no doubt.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in a little pushback here. What I get, I'm just forwarding the pushback that I get. A lot of people tell me, Jake, you're just trying to gaslight the world. Look at the basket of goods, the consumer price index. Inflation's not that bad, Jake. You paranoid people, you, Gerald Celente, Peter Schiff, it's people like you that's scaring people. Stop it, Jake. What would you guys say to someone like that?
Yeah, I would say that person is exactly right. Inflation is nowhere to be found until you look at financial instruments. You could also look at the price of hardened metals and find the exact same thing playing out over time, right? So gold, silver, really, really very high right now. Bitcoin, and we all know the story of Bitcoin. It's almost to $30,000 a coin, whereas 6 months ago it was 3,000. All right, so there's some lunacy in that market, but there's no lunacy in the Dow. There's no lunacy in the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, right? These are very clear and obvious things. You can go buy bread, milk, Coke, meat, cheese, and the price is going to be the same as it's been for years. Go buy one share of the S&P 500 and compare it to what that would have cost you 30, 20, and 10 years ago. And you'll see it very, very clearly. So you don't really feel inflation. Your friend doesn't feel inflation. Any investor feels inflation.
Now, there's a pushback to this, which is, okay, I'm not feeling inflation. That's what matters. So what do I care if the inflation's all in the financial markets? And the answer is you're going to care when things settle down and people start to be comfortable with spending again. And what are they going to do? They're going to be selling off those financial assets and doing what with the money? Spending it on goods and services. All that money is going to come flooding into the markets for goods and services. And then you're going to see stock prices going down and prices of goods and services going up.
And it's weird, right? Because right now we've got a prime example of a market inside the United States it's really unmoored, and that's the real estate market, right? So I bought a house not more than a year and a half ago at 4.125%. I just refinanced in a year and a half to 2.8%, right? And when I did it, I learned that my house has appreciated in value in a year and a half about 15%. Well, of course it did. Of course it did, because you can go take out a big giant loan now at 2.8% and pay it off without any problem at all. In 1983, which was about as bad a time as we've had in this country with interest rates, mortgages were going for between 17 and 18%. Now it's 2%. Trust me, when that happens, the prices of houses will skyrocket because you just buy it with easy money. And it all fits together. And once you take a few steps back and really get a look at it, you can see it for what it is. Now, no matter what our financial situation, there would be problems around the next bend, right? There's always problems. But the problems we're having right now are going to yield a different kind of problem, the kind of problem that threatens the very existence of the nation. And, because what keeps us together, right? I say this to young people a lot, and I can see the lights turn on in their eyes. If the government of France disappeared tomorrow, well, you'd still have French people. If the government of Germany disappeared tomorrow, you'd still have Germans. If the government of the United States disappeared tomorrow, what the hell would you have? Because even now, a couple hundred years after we were founded, there's not a clear answer to what we are individually, right? Chesterton, when he toured the United States in the 1920s, said that the United States was the only country in the world ever founded on a creed, that all men are created equal. That's what you have to believe to be an American. And that was lovely. And I think in 1922, it was absolutely correct. At this point, not so much. And I've lived in New England. I've lived in the Midwest. I've lived in the Mountain West and the Desert West and California. And these are radically different places. They have different cultures. The culture that I'm in now in Tucson, Arizona, shares much more with the Mexican culture that we border up against than we do with almost any part of the United States. New England and Tucson share nothing, right? It's night and day. So when we start having things like monetary collapse, what we are becomes a very interesting question, because if we're not one thing, then we have to break into separate countries. And I've always said it's probably going to look like the FEMA map, which divides the country into 10 zones for disaster relief. Those zones make a lot of sense. It's New England, it's the Mountain West, it's the Desert West, right? These things, the chunks of places, hang together in such a way that you could look at it and say, wow, that's perfectly sensible. And it's hard for me to admit that I'm giving the government a compliment in some way. But they got this right to make this map. They got it right. And where we all end up on the other side of it, I don't know. I suspect we end up allies, deep friendship, this kind of thing, but not under the same head.
Question there. Well, a couple questions, James, because I've heard the same thing postulated. I believe I was watching a Tim Pool podcast, who's, I think, a fairly decent podcaster, and he suggested that, yeah, would end up something like a FEMA configuration or something, 5 different nations, where Pennsylvania, like the North, Pennsylvania, New York, maybe working with Canada. You guys, actually, you and Jake being in Texas, you being in Arizona, would be working with Mexico and maybe Honduras and maybe the Golden Triangle. I feel China would work with California and some of the more neo or liberal or progressive states, if I can use that terminology, and maybe Europe would favor the Midwest. I'm thinking that I could definitely see that happen. The issue is that everybody wants to jump at it, and I'm all for secession if people want to do it peacefully. But then the issue always comes up, what about, this is going a little bit further than monetary theory, so what about Russia? What about Iran? What about China? What about people who don't like us? Can't they just, and they always think they're just going to come over. Now, I don't necessarily buy that, but I know they're going to use that talking point. We divide, they're coming over.
And look, we all have, every part of the West has a certain animosity, a certain friction, right, with China, with Russia, and at some points that's a very productive friction, right? It's no shock to me that we buy most of our stuff from China. It's just cheaper, right? We all know this. So of course that's what we're going to buy. The real problem that we're going to have isn't going to be from foreign countries, although we are going to have problems with foreign countries, right? Especially in that year and a half or so right after the collapse. I suspect our problems become Middle Eastern problems, right? We've been messing about in those countries so often that I think a lot of them would be only too happy to return the favor. And if our currency crashes, they will take that as evidence that God loves them better. And I don't see a good way to argue that that's not correct, right? So keep in mind that there are all kinds of possible problems that might bubble up to the surface. In the end, though, I don't think they're going to amount to much, because in the end, human beings, no matter where they are, all want basically the same things. We want to have a comfortable life. We want to live in a nice house. We want to raise our children. We want to get them off into the world, right? And I've been, I don't know, probably 20 different countries, and every place I go, that's what people want. So I guess that's just what people want everywhere you can go. And I think that's fair, right? Now, how can you do that? Well, now it gets a little trickier. It's not so bad that we can't figure it out.
I want to go back and give the optimist take on this again, because
I thought that was the optimist take.
James, you never give the optimist take. James raises a good point when he says, you get rid of the federal government. What are we? And the fact is, that's nothing new. That's the way we were in this country up until about the 1920s. that people
Yep.
perceive their state as being the thing they identified with. So I'm a Pennsylvanian and James is an Arizonan, whatever it is. And the federal government was kind of a secondary afterthought.
Yeah.
It's
That
only
was
been,
correct until the progressive review
yeah,
of all things. Right.
it's only been since about the 1920s when we started to remove the shackles of the Constitution from the federal government that it grew to what it is. So what we're talking about is a crash. I'm seeing more as a return to our roots, what we are, an association of independent states united under a single judicial system.
And you could see, I mean, following out from that point, the point you just laid down, and I think is correct, actually, you could see a common currency arising out of that, right? You could see a
Oh yeah.
retention of kind of like the euro,
Mm-hmm.
blanketed across any number of countries. That would be difficult, but probably not as difficult as any number of other options, right? So I expect good, level-headed free marketers to always take the easiest, most profitable of the answers, because you'd be an idiot to take some other kind of answer.
And remember that it's only, again, since early 1900s that we've had a federally controlled currency. Our currencies for a long time were issued either by the states or even by private banks. Canada had private free, what was called free banking. The currency was managed privately up until about 1960s, I believe. But there's no reason why that can't be. You don't need a government to manage your currency. This can be handled through markets, actually much more efficiently.
Much more efficiently, but not at all likely, right? When you
Well,
look at,
not at all likely, not because of the markets, but because the government politicians don't want to allow that. There's too much power in controlling the currency.
Exactly right. That's why we'll never dump dollars for Bitcoin, right? The United States government will never say, hey guys, we've been thinking this over and we're going to switch over to Bitcoin. Never going to happen, right? Because that takes away one of their, if not their most overwhelming powers.
Right.
When you can control a currency, what can't you control? And it's no doubt to me, it's not surprising in the least that government types, right? And I'm thinking legislators all the way up to presidents. It's no surprise to me that they don't like to hear about Bitcoin at all, because of course they don't. Of course they don't. Which is why I kind of like it, right? I don't know enough about it to be trading in it myself, not right this minute. But conceptually, I love the idea because it competes against government on fair ground, right? They can't just be wiped away by the power of government. You got to take account of this now, and I'm not sure government's up to the task.
Question on that though, James, maybe little rebuttal. Here's a scenario I'd like to present. So let's say there's enough pushback and the lockdowns end, and then people go in and they start spending, and as Ant said, comes all back and prices start to go higher. What if merchants, what if even big corporations and other individuals not say, okay, well, now that there's some issues with the dollar, we're going to take Bitcoin, or we're going to take alternative forms of payment, and you can pay with your phone or do something else. Is that possible? The free market would organically orient itself towards the blockchain and Bitcoin without politicians? Because that's what I'd like to see, is eventually the people who are saying, Kareem, well, people in the executive branch just have to print 1,200. There's no way. I'm like, you're a fiscal conservative. This is going to end badly. And I say, hey, we can get Bitcoin, we can get gold or tangible asset and start using.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Ant come through with a more technical explanation in a second. But look, if I'm a businessman, I'm going to take anything anybody wants to trade me for whatever I've got. Right. So if you want to give me Bitcoin for my doodads, great. If you want to give me dollars or euros, whatever. I mean, there are very few. I'm not going to take Zimbabwean currency. I have a 300 trillion or $100 trillion bill around here somewhere. I'm not taking the Iraqi dinar because that's toilet paper. And I'm not taking anything that comes out of Venezuela because I don't want to weigh the money. I want to count the money. But of everything else, right? Precious metals, yeah, we could talk about that. I'm looking to buy a car, and I asked the guy today, will you take Venmo on this? right? And that's dollars, but dollars, in a different sort of way. And he looked at me like I had three heads. He couldn't get his head around what I had just said. But I bet by now he's thought it through, and his answer is yes. Because if he can get the money he wants from me that way, and he can't get it from anybody else, he'd be an imbecile not to take it, right? And so it goes. Businessmen know what to do when you just ask them. And Ant, maybe you've got a more technical
No,
answer than this.
I think you're,
Mine is visceral.
I think you're right. Part of the problem with cryptocurrencies in general is they're not very user friendly right now. But I think what James is describing is something analogous to what happened with the lockdown and Zoom. James and I were using Zoom for years before the lockdown. And from my perspective, the best thing the lockdown did is it forced everybody to figure out how to use Zoom. And now I can call all sorts of people I couldn't call before. And I think a crash of the dollar would do the same thing with Bitcoin. It would, or any cryptocurrency, it would force people to start using it. And once people start using it, businesses are going to be happy to accept it.
Sure. And keep in mind, too, that we're in a place with cryptocurrencies that is very much analogous to where we were in the 1950s with the introduction of television. Right? We've got this brand new technology. Everybody could look at a TV and know it was going to become transformative, but it wasn't yet because it was new technology. It was very, very expensive. So regular people didn't get TVs. And then a weird thing happened. A bunch of TV networks emerged. And you looked at those and you could have said something like, somebody's going to get rich betting on these networks. And that was true, but it wasn't true of all of them. And if you had taken all of your money and put it on the DuPont network, you would have been screwed. If, on the other hand, you said CBS seems like a really solid thing, you would be nothing but happy for the rest of your life. But look at what you had, the evidence that you had. There wasn't a way to make that call. It was just going to be dumb luck, which means that really smart people didn't get into it at all. Smart money is conservative money. It goes to places where we all know there's going to be a return. Smart money will take a 7% return, even if they think that they could get 35 somewhere else if everything broke just right. Smart money is very conservative.
Quick question for you guys. With the Bitcoin, well, forget the Bitcoin. There's Ethereum. There's a bunch of cryptocurrencies, but this is what I fear. The government doesn't like competition. You guys know this. I'm concerned, seriously concerned that when Bitcoin gets more users, we're in the early adopters phase, and the product cycle, we go up and then it matures. I don't even think we'll make it to the maturity side. I have a feeling that this is pure speculation on my part. I can't prove any of this, but I think the government's going to get involved and ban these currencies under the guise of protecting people. They're going to put a pretty face on it and say, we want to protect these poor consumers. We're about consumer protection. And this is a scam they're running. These hackers are running a scam on you, when sophisticated investors know what they're doing. But so my question to you guys, do you think the government's going to get involved and shut that down possibly?
Oh, I think it's going to attempt to do so, but it's going to be more subtle about it. And you see it happening already. This year, when you fill out your tax forms, in the top front page, it's going to ask the question, the IRS will ask the question, did you invest in cryptocurrency? And what they're doing is bringing it up to the fore and warning everybody that if you've done any of this, that you have to go through the tax machinations and pay what you owe. There are going to be people who are on the fence about cryptocurrency who see that and they're going to say, it's not worth the hassle. I don't want to run afoul of the IRS. If we get to the point that enough people have said, all right, I'll do the taxes. I don't care. I'm going to use cryptocurrency anyway. I would not at all be surprised if we saw something like a push to require that all cryptocurrency investors be accredited. Now, we have that now when it comes to not new issues of stock. So a new corporation is coming out with stock for the first time. You can't invest in that stock unless you are accredited, which means you've got, I forget what the numbers are, but something like you have to have an income over $250,000 and or $1 million in the bank. So what it does, and it's under the guise, as you said, Jacob, it's under the guise of protection. What the government's doing is protecting small investors who don't know much about this new stock. We keep them out of the market until the stock starts to trade some, then they can come in. I can see them making the same argument about cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I can too. And the downside, the Achilles heel to that argument is that none of the people who would regulate cryptocurrency know where to find it. Right? It's
Right.
just
Yeah.
out there. It's just out in the wild at this point. And I love it for exactly that reason, right? They can't get their hands on it. And if the United States government can't get their hands on it, and they can't, who else can't? Well, China can't. For a
Right.
Chinese person to leave China, you're going to have to forfeit most of the wealth you've accumulated. Or you could have Bitcoin. North Koreans, isn't that interesting? If they've got a dime anywhere, and if they're up and running underneath their government's radar, we could send them Bitcoin that they could then use to buy goods and services to get them the hell out of North Korea. And you start to see how all of these things fit together. And yeah, Bitcoin's a bit of a long shot, but it's less of a long shot than it ever was before. And look at what it might be able to accomplish. If you can defang government, any government, by using an alternate currency, everybody in the world just got a little freer. And isn't that something?
Yeah. And I
And
want to
this is how it's going to happen, right? It's not going to happen because the government comes to an understanding. It's going to happen because they got no damn choice.
Yeah, I want to underline what James just said, that cryptocurrency is coming. It will replace currencies as we understand it. The question before the federal government is, does it want to embrace that change and help it along now, or does it want to fight it and it will inevitably win? It may be decades into the future, but it's going to win.
And if you look around, you see all kinds of things that have been currency over the years, right? We could talk about baseball cards or guitars or gold and silver and platinum and palladium, right? These are the more obvious choices. Whenever there's real domestic strife in any country, liquor becomes money very quickly, and cigarettes every bit as quickly, because that's what people want. And if people will trade liquor for goods and services, what do I care? As long as I can get goods and services, that's what I'm in the mood for, right? So if I don't want my liquor and I do want, I don't know, chicken and beef to eat for the family, I'll make that trade every time. I know I will because it's a trade I'm already making, except I don't convert my dollars into liquor first. There's nothing weird about any of this. Or this is really, at the end of the day, just a lot of common sense. And if you want to know who the villains are in this story, find out who's saying something like, "Well, who are you going to believe, me or your own lion eyes?" And that's the thief. And I've just described government. Some private people too, but I've really just described government.
So can I follow up with you guys? So you guys are both, I would say, libertarians for the most part in terms of like your fiscal, like your philosophy, I should say, your fiscal philosophy, like macro and on the macro economy. You guys are both. I don't know what school of thought you'd call it, Chicago school or Austrian school. Are you guys more or less like that way of thinking?
Yeah, we've over the years we've come to kind of be uncomfortable. We get squeamish about using the term libertarian. I think classical liberal is a better term because it refers not to a political stance, but to a philosophical underpinning. And the philosophical underpinning is that people should be free to do as they will, provided they aren't imposing harm on anyone else.
Yeah, I'm happy with classical liberal. I'm just about as happy with Whig, if you must. Libertarian calls to mind for people who don't know a lot of libertarians, and maybe to people who do know a lot of libertarians. It makes you think of the tinfoil hat crowd, right? A lot of libertarians are just batshit crazy, and that's not us. It's just not us. If you think it through, I think it's the right perspective. And I think Ant and I, if we were shoved in a room and forced to define ourselves, sooner or later we would come to equal parts Austrian and Chicago. Okay. I think that's about where we're at. Ant's more Chicago, I'm more Austrian, but that's where we would be.
And the whole reason I ask is there's this new school of thought. Well, it's not new. It's quite common in a lot of universities. It's called the post-Keynesian economics way of thinking. I mean, you guys know this. It's very, very common. There's a lady. She's she's an economist. I put that in air quotes because I guess anybody can be an economist these days. And her name is Stephanie Kelton, and she has this book.
She's a
It
nut.
just came out. Okay,
She's a
thank
crazy
you. Okay,
person.
you guys know who I'm talking about. So
Sure.
I just
We-
read the
We
preface.
asked her.
the intro-
We asked her to come on our podcast, and never heard back from her. Oddly enough.
Oh man, okay, because I wanted to ask, because so I just had her book. I just read the first chapter, like the introductory pages. She literally believes the Federal Reserve is not like a household or a business or a firm, like a closed system. There's still, you have incoming flows, outgoing, but she believes that whatever the country needs, you just print it off. Like I'm not even slightly kidding around with you guys when I say that.
Yeah,
she thinks,
yeah, look-
oh, it's whatever the country needs. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's the most, I don't want to say vocal, she's the most obvious proponent of MMT, modern monetary theory. And there's some footnotes to what you just said. So she will say, yeah, we could just print the money that we need to spend. And then someone will come back with, well, what about inflation? To which she'll reply, yeah, but we can use taxation to fix that problem. Because as the Federal Reserve prints money and spends it, we now get more money in the system. The federal government can use its power of taxation to tax that money back out of the system so that you don't end up with so much money that you now get inflation. Yeah. And that sounds reasonable until you realize that she just pulled a bait and switch.
That's right.
Because when the Federal Reserve prints these dollars, and who spends them first is the federal government. So the federal government's spending these new dollars and then turning around and taxing the money back. What it's really doing when all the dust settles is replacing the things that consumers want with things that politicians and bureaucrats want. So you may still have a $20 trillion GDP, but instead of that GDP being made up of $20 trillion worth of cars and houses and hamburgers, it's going to be $20 trillion worth of tanks and border walls and grenades, right? Whatever it is that the government wants. And so I think this is laying at the bottom of everything, and this is not too far afield from Keynesian economics, which when the dust settles, that's exactly what Keynesian economics does. It replaces what people want with what politicians want.
Exactly.
And if you look at the MMT nonsense, this is the brave new world of government redistribution. Right? This is just another way for government to take from the people it has no use for and to give it back to the majorities that will yield electoral wins. Right? It's just part of the same damn thing. I don't know how people continue to fall for it. But if we get here, and notice too, this is exactly the only way to fund a universal basic income. Right? We're not going to get that unless we already have walked the MMT plank, because there's just not enough money to do it. Now there are 330 million Americans. How are you going to give them all $2,000 a month? Good luck to you. Right? Good luck. But with MMT, it's possible. And here's the kicker. If she's right, and if money doesn't really matter, why do I have to pay taxes at all?
Right.
Why is anybody paying taxes? Let's just print more. And we're not going to do that because everybody realizes at the end of the day that that's just stupid, right? It's you'll excuse me, it's fucking stupid. So we're not going to do that. But if that's stupid, trust me, anything short of that down the same road is exactly as dense. And what we're seeing here are a bunch of people lighting the fire underneath the United States that will eventually cause it to burn. Sorry, but that's what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to follow up with another question for you guys. So I've had this debate with a lot of people. They say, well, we can just print because we have this military. This is what a lot of the leftists, I would say more of the moderate left position is. And I would even say the military industrial complex, this is what they argue as well in the Israel lobby. They're more or less, Jake, we can just print away. The reason why? We have a military. If someone calls in our debt, we can just stop them. They said it's been that way since Richard Nixon. And they say, son, it's been this way for 50 years. It'll always be this way. And anyway, what my rebuttal to that argument is, well, what if our dollar's not worth anything? We go to pay the military and they don't accept it. Like at that point. So my question to you guys is, when do you think we'll get to that point where the military won't even accept the money? Because I know that's what protects us from other countries calling in our debt, but what's going to happen when the military doesn't accept that money? They're like, we will just walk away from our position.
Yeah, let me back you up a
Sure.
step. Because people say this about calling in the debt. There is no such thing as calling in the debt. When the federal government borrows money, it does so by issuing treasury bills. A treasury bill is a contract, and it says the federal government promises to pay you a certain amount of money on a specific date. It is not, I promise to pay you the money when you want it. It's on a specific date. There is no such thing as calling the debt. The most that a foreign government can do, and foreign governments have been doing this over the past decade, is that as the treasury bills they're holding expire, so they expire and now you hand it back, you get your cash back, they aren't buying more. Well, they are buying more, but they aren't buying as much more. So they're not feeding more money into the system, into the federal government as they were in the past. That's the best they could do. You can't call in debt. You can't just show up one day and say, I want my money back.
Well, you can, but they'll just laugh at you.
But yeah.
The weird thing here, Ant, is that, that's right. Countries are not re-upping to the same degree they once did. But from the politician's perspective, that's money that's going to have to be found somewhere else.
Right. And you can see this if you look at the numbers. You could track this over time. How much of the federal debt is held by American citizens, American companies? How much is held by foreigners, foreign governments, foreign companies? How much is held by the Social Security Trust Fund? And how much is held by the Federal Reserve? And if you track those numbers, what you see is the Social Security Trust Fund has been divesting itself of debt. It's holding less and less debt, necessarily so, because it's got to raise money to pay retirees. Foreign governments and Americans are buying more and more federal debt, but they aren't increasing their purchases to the extent that the federal government is borrowing more. Right. Who's taking up the slack is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is becoming the lender of last resort. And if numbers continue the way they're going in another decade or two, we could easily see the Federal Reserve as holding 50% or so of federal debt.
And that's not a great situation.
Yeah, and what's the difference? The difference here is when the Federal Reserve gets hold of federal debt, the way it gets hold of it is by printing dollars. Everybody else is using dollars that already exist.
But I'm the pessimist, right? That sounded pretty grim.
Actually, based on pessimism, optimism, I'm really enjoying this. Just one last question before you go, James. I know you have a hard stop. So this is something I've been doing in my own head because I've been in lockdown. The idea sounds good to me. And the problem is, though, I read something that sounds good. It doesn't always work. Here's my question. Let's say the dollar has problems or we go to a new currency system. Is it possible, if you want to call it Rothbardian or voluntarism, is it possible to start a new system with taxation completely voluntary? Have a society that says you are not required by force to pay something, but whatever you want to pitch in, we can give you some incentive, we can make it fees, we can do something different, but we're not going to do taxation with coercion anymore. Is that possible in either your perspectives to have society work like that post dollar being ineffective?
Yes and no. We tried it once. We called it the Articles of Confederation, and it wasn't the people who were paying, it were the states, and the states weren't paying nearly enough for the federal government to persist. There is a way to do some of it that way, and that's by fee for use. So rather than taxing people to pay for whatever you're paying for, let's say we're talking about fire protection or schools or what have you, charge people. And what will happen is you don't have to force the people at gunpoint to pay, but if you don't pay, you don't get the service.
Right. And I'm going to say that, no, that's not possible. It's never been possible and it never will be, for all kinds of human nature reasons.
Okay. Because, there's part of me that still wants Rothbard's ideas to work. The more I read him, the more I'm convinced. But maybe I'm not going to say it's impossible, but right now I feel it is. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But
And I think you've stumbled upon the argument for government. There are some things we have to do that can only be handled in that way. They can't be done by a fee for service. So you got to have a taxation. You got to have taxation. That means you're going to have a government. And so
Right.
by no means are we anti-government, but we're very much right government.
Yeah, and this is where Anthony and I take leave of the anarchists, right? We're just not anarchists. We're minarchists. We think the government should only do a few things. But going all the way back to Machiavelli in the modern world, he knew in the 16th century that there were some things that government absolutely had to do, and you couldn't farm it out. Not the least of which the military. Do you really want to rely on foreign mercenaries in all of your militaristic capacities? Well, that's crazy. They run at the first sign of trouble. They're not linked to the soil, right? You are. So this sort of thing, you start thinking about it and how far out does that go? Well, it doesn't go all that far. We can conceive of a limited state that would work infinitely better than this gubbins that we now live with. Whether we'll ever get there or not, that's another question.
And if you're particularly wedded to Medicare or Social Security or whatever it is, UBI, fine, but do it at the state level. That way we have 50 experiments that are competing with each other rather than one monopolistic system.
That's not working, right? That's about to go bankrupt. So.
So I'll say to that, I just want to welcome Max Henry as one of my co-hosts as well. He joined a little bit late. He's working towards going to a more economically suitable place in Florida as opposed to New Jersey right now. What I would say,
hey guys.
So what I would say in rebuttal, James, is I also read Robert Murphy, his idea, and me and Max actually came up with a bunch of ideas because I'm a weirdo. I get it. I want voluntarism to work so bad. I was sitting at night saying, how can a decentralized society defend against a centralized power? I came up with a few suggestions. One is Robert Murphy's idea of insurance. You would have private insurance companies. Jake from State Farm would call you up and say, hey, if you get hit by something from China or something from Russia, I will give you this payment. Also, in terms of the Pentagon, they spend trillions of dollars. I feel based on patriotism, like we're all Americans or we're all this, or you could have decentralized defense. Also, Max came up with a brilliant idea. If we could get everyone on blockchain after the dollar, we could say Pennsylvania has this many units, this many units, this many units, and America is this many units. If one country attacks this country or one region attacks this region, that currency would shift from.
Let me get in on that. Let me explain that. Well, that was an interesting one. It would have to do with a centralized. Eventually, they want to move to a centralized monetary system, like the Bank of London, the IMF. They all want to do that, right, guys? So if that were to happen, and of course they would use a token for cryptocurrency because it's easier than cash. It could be tracked better in cash. This is something authoritarians would love. What you could do is you could set up a fund, and this could be by voluntary measure. You could set up funds where each country has these funds, and if you attack a certain country, that country gets all the funds automatically. It's automatically transferred. You follow? So that's one thing. And also, I think James was mentioning something about how we would have to pay. He brought up Machiavelli. I love The Prince, read The Prince. Great reference there. But if you start hiring French mercenaries, they're not going to protect you, right? However, the United States doesn't need to hire from without. So obviously, American people, we're the largest armed body in the world as a population. We're like a giant Switzerland. Now, we don't have nuclear power, but there's nuclear power here. So if the state failed, somebody would own that nuclear power. And you would hope that we wouldn't sell it to like China or like Russia or someone we couldn't trust. Again, that's the foreign, mercenary idea. I think what you want to do is you keep it internal. Texas would own a lot, et cetera, wherever these power plants may be.
Yeah, I think we're spending a lot of time thinking about how to handle military in a more voluntarist society. And I think we miss the most important factor, which is that the more people are free to engage with each other economically, the less likely they are to come to war with each other. It just makes sense, because the more economic ties we have to China, for example, the more costly a war is going to be, because we have people I'm buying and selling stuff with, and the more difficult it is to convince the people to get behind the war, because you can't tell me that these are the enemy. I know these people. I deal with them every day on the phone. We're talking
Right.
about buying and selling things. I have a personal connection. So I think that a better use of our energies, if our goal is to prevent armed conflict, is to look for ways to increase market freedoms.
Agreed.
Hey, real quick rebuttal to that. There's a lot of people that like to cheat in a system. No, seriously, this is a big problem I've had. This is something I struggle with. I shouldn't say it's something I deal with on a daily basis, but it's how do you deal with the cheaters in those type of systems? Like, let's say there's a lot of free trade going on. Like, obviously, we're going to get. I mean, we'll be more prosperous as a society. But the problem is there's the free rider problem and there's the cheater problem, and they're here. I mean, the United States. I mean, we're growing them by the day. I mean, it's getting bad. I mean, it's getting really bad. But I think it's because we're becoming less free. But what would you guys say to that problem? How do you solve the cheater and free rider problem in a free society? Oh, by the way, when you don't have courts that want to punish people and you have a subverted justice system.
Yeah, see, well, that's the thing. When we talk about free society, when James and I talk about free society, we don't mean a society without government. We mean a society with a strong, though limited, government whose purpose it is to prevent precisely the things that you just described. And so if we're having a free rider problem, if we're having a cheating problem, that's not an economic problem. It's a government problem. Our government is not doing enough.
And we're going to have those problems because those are human nature problems. You can't
Yeah,
solve
yes.
it. But you can manage it over time.
Mm-hmm.
And managing it's probably the best you're ever going to do, and you'll even fail sometimes at that. So
I think you're absolutely right in terms when it comes to a monarchy, a small constitutional government like we had, but we see it in history every single time. When it comes to Rome, Greece, etc. I mean, I prefer Rome as an example instead of Greece, but it grows into an empire regardless. If the cheating's not at the bottom with the socialism, it's at the top with the politicians getting lobbied. And so I think you would have to definitely remove corporate personhood. You would have to do that, which we don't have. That's probably not going to.
This is another episode, I think, but our corporate rules are, I think, quite good, actually.
All right. So
hold on. You actually think that corporate personhood is a good thing?
I do. Yeah. That would take an hour to unpack, but yeah.
So let's actually debate that next time. We can have definitely. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, James and Anthony, for coming on.
And
thank you,
Kareem. Yeah.
I can't tell you, Kareem, how gratifying it is. You and I were together a little bit, like 15 years ago. When you were at St. Vincent, and I think you were in one of my classes, right? The justice class.
Yes.
And it was nice knowing you then, and it's really gratifying to see you now, right? So thanks for having us on. It was really great seeing you.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to say a huge thank you to James and Anthony. They have an amazing podcast, Words and Numbers, where they discuss economic things similar to us and stuff going on in current events. They also do very good work in economics, both of them, and they have a good background in classical liberal thought. So I just want to thank everyone who tuned in to Liberty and Consciousness. We'll definitely have them on again. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good night.
Thank you.